I would say the best thing to do is you could say, hey, great job keeping your balance. If you want to make it even better, push up on the bar like the ceiling's falling. So that gets people's attention much better, and it's a much better received piece of information than saying, hey, good start, but. So trying to avoid using the word but and use and instead. This was great. Here's what would make it better. And that lands much differently to an athlete than using the word but, right? And you're not being overly flowery, because that will drive people crazy too, right? No one just needs endless compliments. Well, maybe some people do, but having a different phrasing, I think, can go a long way.
Hi, Anna. Welcome to Evidence Strong Show. It's my pleasure to have you. Please introduce yourself briefly.
I'm Anna Wright. I'm the Director of Sports Science and Coach Development at USA Weightlifting. And I've spent just a ton of time in the field in various roles, from a track coach, strength coach, sports scientist, instructional designer, university professor, and I'm a beekeeper. So I've kept busy over the last 20 years, but always sort of had a hand in the field of coaching and really enjoy it.
Okay, so we met today to talk about communication in weightlifting specifically. So I think we should start with definition. So what do you consider communication?
Yeah, so communication has a verbal component and a nonverbal component. And I think everyone would probably agree that the way you give feedback is probably more impactful than the words itself. So think about it this way. If I were to say like, oh, or oh, it's the same word, right? But depending on how your face looks, how you stand, what your arms are doing, it sort of adds to what people are hearing. So I think you have to be really careful that you can yell at an athlete, relax. No one's relaxed, right? So you got to look at it both the words, and athletes are going to look to you. They're going to look to you for how calm you are, what's going on, what you mean. Are you standing like this, when you say it? Are you, ooh? So I think people have to pay attention to both things, and that's often really difficult. I think I'll back up for 1 second and just think about, why should it really matter to coaches? A lot of times coaches spend a lot of time in the preparation, just, technique and tactics and biomechanics and all those things. And I think the more people get into it, the more they realize that the job is actually highly relational. A big part of a coach's job is to inspire athletes, to motivate people. Oftentimes people say that coaches got more out of them than they thought they could get out of themselves, right? That's something that coaches have to actively cultivate. It's not something that you just learn in a textbook and go, right, okay, put this training plan together. You're a robot. Here you go, done. So I think you have to think about, to prepare people best, mentally, physically, emotionally for their sport. Communication and relationships are really at the heart of that. So, in my mind, when we try to step back, what does a coach need to be successful? They got another sport. Okay. You got to know weightlifting. You have to understand physiology. You have to understand biomechanics. That's a given. And I think most coaches are most interested in that. They go to school, they have a mentor, they coach a bit, they ask their peers. And then I think they realize pretty quickly that coaching and teaching are pretty much the same thing, right? So know how to be a teacher, and whether that's motor learning and best practices for learning new skills, or giving feedback, which, does get into communication too. I think that's something that is part of the job. I think the more I've been involved in coaching and coach development, helping coaches be better coaches, working with different types of athletes, I think you have to also know how to manage relationships and deal with people. And that's where people fall short. So, the communication part of being a successful coach is kind of where that theory of how does this sport work and how does this training plan work, it sort of meets the reality of who's in front of me. You might hear the phrase, coach the athlete that's in front of you, not the athlete that you wish was in front of you. So there's all sorts of things about, how training should work. What happens if that athlete gets sick or they're having a bad day, or how do you adapt? And it's the adaptation that I think people aren't so great at. And so improving their communication and their ability to build relationships, I think, is ultimately what people realize after, a lot of time in books learning about physiology. Then, that's what I need to do as a sport. And so weightlifting, right? We always joke, I think the Germans have 33 exercises for weightlifting. Right? Everyone kind of knows the same 33 exercises. Right? At some point, it becomes how you arrange them, how you apply them, when you do what. So there's not a strong emphasis, at least in my experience in the US, there's not a strong emphasis on the communication and relational aspect of coaching. But if you talk to coaches, that's where they really shine, good ones. That everyone at some point knows X's and O's. And so that's why I think it's really important to talk about that. And I say that as someone who spent a lot of time learning about the science, how the body works and adapts, right?
Could you expand a little bit on it's important to know who is in front of you? So do you have any concepts we could use to learn the athlete as coaches?
Yeah. So in thinking about, how are we going to figure out this athlete? How are we going to work with them? We probably have to be a really good listener. And I think that's something that people really struggle with. If we think just globally about communication, it's often, talking. So people are often thinking, oh, communication, it's me talking. But thinking about the ways that people might listen, again, there's a nonverbal piece to that. But you can kind of ignore people like, yeah, okay, I see what you're saying. You can sort of pretend to hear, yeah, I get a little bit. You can kind of have selective listening. You can really be attentive to what they're saying. But then there's that sort of next level of listening, which is sort of empathetic. So you're waiting your turn to speak. You're waiting to share something instead of just saying, oh, yeah, I did that too. So, you're not just listening to what people are saying, you're listening to understand, not waiting to speak next. You're trying to see things through their eyes. They're trying to figure out, what is that person trying to say? How are they feeling? And how do they want me to feel? And giving them some space to share. So I think coaches need to really think about the power dynamic of coach athlete and try to draw information out of athletes and really think through, how can I help that athlete feel comfortable and share what they want and really genuinely take an interest? There's a difference in like, hey, how's it going today? Versus like, hey, what'd you do this weekend? What was the most fun thing you did? And genuinely, engaging with that person. It's tricky. You may work with someone that you really connect with. You may work with people that you really don't have a strong connection with and you're a little bit less comfortable. So you kind of have to feel people out and figure out how that's going to be. But your job, right, is to adapt to each new situation, whether it's the training plan or the human. So the human has to do the training plan.
Athletes often look up to coaches for guidance. For example, in competition, in a stressful situation, athletes will rely on coaches to make decisions. Would you have any tips how to navigate that?
Yeah, so coaching under stress, I think, goes back to this idea of how you carry yourself and how you speak. And making sure, athletes are looking to you when they're under stress. And if they see you're calm, right, they'll feed off that. If they see you're, worried and smashing clipboards and ripping up your warm-up cards, that's going to be really difficult. So I think you need to make sure that you're modeling what it is that you're saying, not just screaming relax at your lifter. In a stressful situation, you would hope that you're still yourself, right? You would hope that it's the relationship that you have with that athlete and the trust that you've built with them that kind of carries you through. So nothing really should change, but coaches probably should take an extra minute to check their own body language and just to make sure that they're not like, no, you got this. And then you see a lot of that, especially when lifters, they may not see it in the moment, like on the platform, they may not be looking at you, but someone is filming you when the lifter is going, right? And they're going to see your face where it's like, oh, at the end of it, and it's not going to be good. Your athlete's going to be like, you didn't think I had that? I had that. Come on, you said I was good for it. So just always assume someone is watching, right? And carry yourself, appropriately, I think. Thinking about some helpful, things to think about with effective communication between coaches and athletes, or even, coaches between coaches. So I can fill in on that a little bit if that's helpful.
Yeah, I think it is. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think there's some things to think about more broadly in your communication, and then, kind of smaller points. So, I talked about listening, more broadly, that's a thing you want to do. Another thing that I always like to point out to coaches is that teaching doesn't always equal learning, right? Just because the coach said something doesn't mean that the athlete in front of you understands. Okay? Oftentimes athletes will just be like, right, yep, I got that. Keep your shoulders over the bar. Oh, okay, all right. And they don't understand you, but they're not going to ask because they don't want to look silly. They're sort of afraid. So as a coach, I think a really good habit in terms of communication is to do a check for understanding. So instead of being like, right, everyone's clear on this, which sort of implies that you should already know, you shouldn't need any more direction. You can either say something like, what questions might you have, which opens the floor that it's permissible, or this check for understanding of, hey, someone show me how your body should look when you receive a jerk. Someone just show me, right? Someone in this group show me. Or, hey, what should you already have done with 15 minutes left before introductions? And then it's up to them to say it back to you. Because just because you said it doesn't mean it's clear to them. And that way you can clear it up before it becomes a problem. So I think that sort of changing the way you operate and asking them to sort of say it back to you in a way, as opposed to just assuming that they heard you and they understand. I think that can be helpful. In weightlifting, I know this is a good controversial one when it comes to cueing, the internal-external cueing debate.
Mm-hmm.
Have you had anyone on about that? Whether you should use internally focused cues or externally focused?
I haven't had anyone specifically speaking.
It's been going on. It's, any cue is a good cue, and those coaches aren't wrong, right? If the athlete does what you asked them to do with what you said, great. But if we look at motor learning and we think about what's going to be most effective for, effective skill learning, we have to look at external cueing. And that's really hard for coaches that are used to saying, squeeze your glutes, engage your lats, feel your hamstrings, directing attention internal to the body, as opposed to like punch the ground away or, lift up like the ceiling's falling on you or stomp a spider. You're getting the focus, outside of the athlete's body. And I do think it's really worth taking the time to focus on external cueing. I think the literature is pretty clear that external cueing is going to be more effective, specifically in the sport of weightlifting, where you don't want people thinking, right? You want people to feel, not think. When you think, you're slow. So the less they're thinking, the better off we are. We can start to change the way that we cue to match up with what we know to be more effective. So maybe you are a coach that says, engage your hamstrings, or really, I want you to tighten your lats when you lift off. Maybe we can think about different ways to change that. And that's some of what we talk about, in our USA Weightlifting coach certification courses. So I will say I had a wonderful coach in a course that came up with a way better cue than I had heard, which is when you're starting in the start position, coaches will be like, engage your lats, right? It doesn't look like they're really set. Engage your lats. But that's not really great. And again, if they do it and they understand, okay, but maybe we could just rephrase that and say, hey, squeeze oranges in your armpits, right? When you're getting ready in that set position, squeeze those oranges in your armpits. It will get you the same thing. Or squeeze a walnut between your shoulder blades. Or, pinch my finger back here. Squeeze toothpicks in your armpits. Something to get them to feel it, and they will get themselves in the right position. So this idea of letting them get to the same place with less of an internal focus. And that's hard for a lot of coaches, because if you go to their weight rooms or you hear a lot of cues, it's lats, glutes, hips, knees, everything is sort of internal. And again, you're not a horrible, horrible coach if you're saying, get your knees back off the floor. But where possible, I would challenge coaches to try to find a way to get the same point across with an external cue. Another thing that I see a lot, and I do work with a lot of coaches, we've been teaching online and teaching in person, our level 1 and level 2 coach certification courses. And one of the things that's been really interesting, there's been lots, but looking at the way that people either frame things positively or negatively and how they say things when they watch a lift. So they might say, hey, Alex, that set was pretty good, but next time I want you to do this, right? And you're going to focus on whatever was after the but. Right? Like however good you did it, most athletes are going to like, yeah, but what? What did I actually do wrong? And it's just, that's what happens. So as coaches, right, we're not just trying to say something positive for the sake of saying something positive, because I don't think that's really great for building a trusting relationship. Like, Alex, that was great. Amazing. Maybe make this little tweak. I love your outfit. Not great. So, you could say, good lift, but the start needs work. The athlete's deflated and all they hear is my start needs work. You could say, I like that you finished that set super strong. Next time, focus on pushing, through the ground at the start. So you've said something, right, that you liked and some instruction for the next time. So I like that you did this. Next time, focus on that. Okay, seems more reasonable. I would say the best thing to do is you could say, hey, great job keeping your balance. If you want to make it even better, right? Push up on the bar like the ceiling's falling. So that gets people's attention much better, right? And it's a much better received piece of information than saying, hey, good start, but. So trying to avoid using the word but and use and instead. But hey, this was great. Here's what would make it better. And that lands much differently to an athlete than using the word but, right? And you're not being overly flowery, because that will drive people crazy too, right? No one just needs endless compliments. Well, maybe some people do, but having a different phrasing, I think, can go a long way. So that would be another thing that I think is really, really helpful for coaches. The last thing I'll say about when I listen to coaches, and I'm not saying I don't do any of these either. I am far and away the best example of things that I have done wrong, and I'm trying to help other people. But making whatever you say actionable. So I don't know if you've run across coaches that have that problem and say, hey, don't let your heels come up, or don't let your arms bend. Instead of saying, hey, next set, keep those feet firmly planted on the ground, right? Be the eagle, claw 'em in, feet flat, stay tight. They'll say the first thing that comes to their mind when they watch the lift, which is what they see as a fault. And they need to wait 5 seconds, right? And then think about what you actually want the lifter to do, as opposed to what you saw was incorrect. And I'll add a second piece to that, which is my colleague who'll be terribly embarrassed, JP Nicoletta. I call it the JP Nicoletta 3-rep rule, which is to say coaches should say nothing until they've seen 3 repetitions. It's not really fair to a lifter to have them do 1 rep and be like, all right, here's what you need. Not fair. So the first rep, you should be sort of watching rhythm and timing and overall movement and see, does anything catch your eye? The second rep, you should be like, okay, that thing that I thought I saw, I'm going to look for a little bit more closely, right? I thought I saw that bar come out a little bit. I'm going to watch, right? How that bar interacts when they get to the hip. I'm going to watch that. And then the third rep is like, is that actually what I saw, right? Is that there? Was it not? Right. So we kind of have this ability to work through before we say anything, right? To make sure that what we're saying is really what we need to be saying. And we have that pause. So I think that's been really, really helpful.
Okay, so we have, in terms of tips for coaches on communication, we have active listening, right? And this is how to make it better. What do you want the athlete to do instead of barely pointing the mistake? And rule. Is there anything else you could add to that? These are amazing.
Always more to add, of course. Thinking through what your questions are. Coaches sometimes will start off saying like, hey, why do you think that bar got away from you? And that's already saying, hey, something didn't go well, and putting them on the defensive. Or is there something about, that lift, but the wire is, or should we be letting the bar get that far out in front of you? Is a tricky way to sort of start that conversation. Why did you make that lift? Is that your best attempt? If you're going to communicate with an athlete, really think about starting your questions more open-ended and without implying any sort of judgment. So something different might be, tell me more about why you decided to max out your clean today. Instead of, why did you not follow the training plan today? And obviously how you deliver that, tell me more about, could be like, come on, knucklehead, stick to the training plan. Like, no. But if you're generally like, hey, tell me more about why you felt like you should go up, from what we had, how you say it in addition to what you say. But that's a lot different than like, why didn't you follow what we had written? It doesn't give them the space to sort of contribute. So maybe starting questions with, tell me more about, or talk me through how you decided to do that, or what did that feel like? So things that kind of give people space to have that discussion. Oftentimes coaches will sort of insert things, particularly when starting questions with, why, or what did you do that for? So yeah, I would say that's another really helpful one, just so coaches can kind of keep track of. We spend a lot of time talking about how we can help athletes, right? We talk about long-term athlete development. We talk about ways that we can improve them. And that's sort of our job as coaches. But we don't talk about what coaches could do every day to be better themselves. And that might be something where you could say, hey, this session, I'm going to focus on not saying the word but, or not asking why questions, or genuinely listening when an athlete, gives me an answer to something. Everyone's got things to work on.
That's so true. So we went through tips for coach-athlete communication. Would you have anything for coach communication?
It's a really good question, right? How can we deal with relationships other than just coach-athlete? And the more I've thought about it, it's really hard to compartmentalize. So all the things that we know about effective communication sort of apply in all aspects of your life. So as you get better at doing that as a coach, it's really hard to not start to do those things in other parts of your life. I have a 4-year-old. I use a lot of the same things when talking to my 4-year-old than I would with an athlete. Like, tell me more about how that water ended up on the floor. And so, I think if we look at what makes you effective as a communicator and thinking about the clarity of your message, the tone of your voice, the way that you're carrying yourself as you say it, effective listening, I really think it translates across all those relationships. You do have to kind of think through, who is that person in front of me and what might they need from me? And that goes back to that empathy and relationships and figuring that out. But if you're a good listener and your body language matches what you say and people believe that you have a positive intent, right? I think a lot of the things with miscommunication are just sort of believing that the intent isn't positive. We can sort of solve a lot of things across everywhere, at least in what I found. So I think it benefits all aspects of people's lives. I'm not sure that I would do a whole lot differently. You just have to be self-aware and a little bit understanding of what it is that that person might need from you.
Okay, so athletes change coaches as they go through their careers. Not everyone, but most, I would say.
Right.
I can see that there could be a benefit of the previous coach talking to the new coach. Would you have any tips how to navigate this situation?
Yeah, so coach swapping does tend to happen a whole lot. And again, you probably need to look at why the athlete switched coaches, because that may influence, the way in which that discussion goes. If an athlete was unhappy with the coach or the coach was unhappy with the athlete and the new coach goes, hey, tell me about this athlete, there may not be a whole lot of goodwill. And so that can be really challenging. I would think that you would want to do basically a little bit of motivational interviewing, a little bit of trying to break down what is it that you can learn about who that athlete is as a person and what sort of works best for them. So if there's some insight to be gained from that previous coach and saying, hey, I find this to be most effective. I think the German team shared, hey, we knew this one lifter really did well when there was an audience. So we had a training camp and we actually invited people. I don't think they gave out tickets, but they brought people in because they knew that athlete would do better in that scenario, right? We talk about a Michael Jordan, he was absolutely an athlete that was dominant, right? Was an alpha and needed some sort of conflict, right? To create some sort of, I'll show them, right? And so how you deal with that person and how you communicate with that person is so different. I'm not going to show you a spreadsheet and explain, right? Well, you have other professional athletes that might be a little bit more analytical, and I could show you a research paper and I could show you bar speed and drop time and, look at all these things and talk about force vectors. And you're like, oh, interesting. Whereas other athletes that might not land. So I think a good coach, would try to get as much information from a previous coach and get information themselves about what's going to work best for that lifter. And I think that's a really fascinating aspect of coaching, right? Is trying to figure out what motivates them, what lands with them. And I'm not sure that that's work that coaches always put in on the front end, because maybe they haven't learned or haven't thought about, that sort of personality type motivational interviewing. It changes the way that you can inspire and motivate, which is a big part of your job. So yeah, I would say a combination of talking to that previous coach about those things and then talking to the athlete, right? And trying to figure out what am I dealing with and what's going to work best for them. And it's going to be different for different athletes. And that's adapting to the situation that you're in that I think is so difficult for coaches, especially younger coaches that have this rigidity about how things are meant to work, because their knowledge really comes from more theoretical rather than, experiential. It's just part of people as they develop in their coaching journey. So my hope is to shorten that learning curve, right? Is to make people aware of those challenges before they dive in and figure out oh, shoot, they're not listening to me. What do I do?
We talked about the need for coaches to get to know the athlete and their personality, what motivates them, and so on. Are there any shortcuts? Because if you're a new coach, you've done your reading, you have experienced the sample of you, if you were an athlete, and that's about it. So are there any shortcuts, any personality type tests we could use to speed up the process of learning about the athlete?
Yeah, so disc profiling is a test, just like that. It's an inventory. And so you could, go through that and learn some things. There's personality tests and things like that. I think over time, you start to develop heuristics. You start to get an idea of, okay, this is the type of person that I'm dealing with. It's a crude shortcut, and it's a good place to start. But like all heuristics, it has its shortcomings. So I think, yes, you over time can say, okay, I think I know what I'm dealing with. But I still think you need to take the time to go through that, because athletes will also surprise you where you think, oh, okay, I've seen you before. And, there's something really important that you need to learn from them. So anytime an athlete feels as though they've been invested in, I think you're off to a really good start with the coach-athlete relationship. So, doing that intake, especially in weightlifting, it's so easy. The number of athletes you have is not astronomical. It's not an American strength coach with 300 athletes across 20 teams. That makes it much, much harder. If we have a group of 20 or 30 athletes, and we're writing reasonably individualized training for those people, we really need to be sitting down with them and having those discussions and making sure that they feel like they're being supported and heard. And so, you might do things, at the end of every practice to remind them that what they want out of their training, whether it's to hit a certain number or to make it to a certain competition or to fix a certain technique issue. Like, you need to have those conversations with them daily. But that first initial meeting really does set the tone. And you should spend some time, making sure that you understand and using those same communication tactics. Like, tell me more about, your experience with that previous coach. Tell me more about what you liked and what you didn't like, or, what goals meetings, things like that, but understanding sort of their deeper motivation. And not all athletes will say straight away, this is what I want. Sometimes you do have to read between the lines, but seeing that person in person and having those conversations, I think will pay really big dividends. I would be lying if I, didn't admit to sometimes forming a preconceived notion of what I'm going to need to do with this particular athlete. That does happen. But I do my best to try to get to know them as a person before I start to label them as, oh, you're going to be one of these. Because that's not entirely fair. But when you have larger groups of people, I think oftentimes coaches have to sort of resort to those heuristics and say, okay, well, I think you're this type of person, so I'm going to use this type of motivation on you. And it's much better, right, in this sort of a sport context where we can do that a little bit more in depth. I think you do have to put the work in. You get out of it what you put in, and I'm not sure there's great shortcuts. You can definitely use like a disc profile or an inventory, but pretty much everything related to monitoring and tracking and readiness and performance, all those sort of hot button things that everyone's trying to find, this predictive model for when you're overtrained, really the most effective tool you have as a coach. And I say this having spent a lot of time looking into those things, right? Is being able to ask an athlete, how are you doing today? And knowing they're going to give you an honest answer, right? No piece of equipment is going to tell you your bar speed is low or your jump height is off or, whatever, more reliably than an athlete saying, this just isn't the day for me. And that's not to say that you as a coach go like, cool, it's not the day for you. Like, take the day off. Like, you have to train when tired, but knowing your athlete's going to be honest is one of the most important things I think you can cultivate as a coach. And part of what gets in the way of that is sport culture, right? And it's also how you set up those conversations and when and where you have them. So we could sort of crudely say there's different sport cultures that are more or less accommodating to athletes honestly saying, I don't feel great, which that's also the culture you create in your gym. I know there's really great tools for athlete monitoring, and that's a whole nother can of worms. But I really believe that having an honest relationship, an honest, trusting relationship with an athlete is going to be your best source of tracking.
Would you have any advice on how the process of intaking an athlete should look like? What are the checkboxes, I guess? Because of course we can't go too much into the detail, but what things should be in place to assure that it will be successful?
I think that's a great question. It's sort of similar to like a physical assessment. Every coach kind of has different things they run people through, and it fits for their context. So I'll say it's really important that you consider the context you're working in, the age of the athlete, the competition level of the athlete, the time and commitment of that athlete, whether it's a large group, little kid, multi-sport. There's so many different factors that come into play, but you certainly want to touch on, what their goals are, what their injury history is, what their sport participation history is, what they sort of enjoy doing when it's not, sport, how much time they have, how many days a week, their vision for how it will go, right? How long is this going to take you? How quickly do you think we can get there? So you get a sense of managing expectations, because I think a lot of reasons that coaches and athletes sort of don't always fit together is that the athlete has a very different expectation of how quickly something will be achieved. And again, if you're a beginner, it's a very sort of different feeling than if you've been doing this a long time. If you're somewhere in the middle and you PR every competition and suddenly you're not, and you're like, what's going on, coach? You're freaking out. You need to kind of know where they are in their development and what their expectations are to then help reframe the goal setting process. So it's no longer going to be, hey, we're going to PR every competition. It's if our end goal is, this higher level, we need to focus on a process goal at this competition, not so much just PRing. And you need to change that mindset. And I need you to know that's something we have to work on. So I think it should be a pretty broad conversation. If coaches aren't familiar with the concepts of motivational interviewing, right, and getting people to sort of share and communicate and starting to understand those things, I would encourage coaches to kind of spend some time there, because what you can learn from those conversations, I think, can prevent a lot of misunderstandings, prevent a lot of frustration, prevent a lot of, athletes feeling like they aren't heard. Something as simple as, is there anything we haven't talked about that you'd like to share or that you'd like to talk about? You'd be surprised how many athletes will then start telling you all sorts of things that to them are super, super important for their coach to know about them as people, as athletes. But because you didn't ask, they sort of feel like they don't really have that good of a connection. So I would encourage coaches to think about the context that they're in and what makes sense, but also err on the side of getting more information than less and having sort of regular, opportunities for follow-up.
Do you have anything more to say about communication in competition specifically or in stressful situations in general? We have two scenarios that are very prevalent in weightlifting. One is you train your athletes as a coach. So you spend time in the gym during the training, but also very important part of weightlifting is competing. And the communication in training and in competition will differ because the goal is different. One is to learn and become better in training, and the other is to perform to the best ability on the day. So I assume the communication may change.
Yeah. That's a great question. Less is more. You don't really want to be fixing things. We always say hay's in the barn. We're not going to be changing things at a competition. We're not going to be focused on technique, this, that, and the other. There's maybe one thing that athlete needs to think about, one thing only. And that can be difficult for coaches, but we don't want to overload them with information. We want to make sure that they're comfortable and that they've got a good routine. And so I think probably the biggest mistake I see is coaches, in between attempts, like, hey, this, blah, 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 like we really shouldn't be doing a whole lot. I would also say that if you're working with a weightlifter, that's pretty new, we're going to want to really reassure them and get them used to that scenario and get them comfortable. So you might do like a gym meet and just sort of a mock meet at your gym. If you're working with a higher level athlete that's gone to lots and lots of competitions, you start to kind of know what they like and what they're like. So you can start to figure out behavior-wise, what kind of timing do they need? How do they react if they have, a missed warm-up that's pretty close to their opener? You can start to see how they react, and you can, again, adjust how you support them based on, what they need. And weightlifting, right, you're going to have a long enough history of competitions that you can start to get a sense of what they need. But really just focusing on being encouraging and keeping it as simple as possible related to technique. And I would say taking off the load for athletes, like it needs to be really clear that they don't need to be involved in worrying about when they should be doing things, what should be on the bar. Like you sit there, lift when I say lift. Don't think about anything else, right? They don't need to be concerned about all the other, pieces at play. And there's that trust element again, right? That they trust you to do the right things for them, where they can just stay focused on what they need to focus on and not worry about all the, like, how many attempts and what's this and go that. In order for that meet to go well, it's really important that you have a meeting before the competition with that athlete to talk about openers, to talk about number of attempts they like to take, that has to happen before. And then I'll say too, there needs to be something after. So when we think about how to deal with athletes after a competition, if it goes well, it's not really that hard to deal with it. Like high five, great job, awesome, all smiles, take the pictures, everything's wonderful. I think it's more challenging to sort of manage a bomb out or kind of debrief a little bit after that, because athletes can get pretty emotional, pretty frustrated. They might shut down a little bit. So whether it's right after or sometime hours after, it's kind of up to you as a coach to figure out. But a helpful sort of acronym, and this is from Betsy Butterick, who's a communication specialist and a former basketball coach that I've been lucky enough to learn a lot from. And she does a lot of work for our communication modules, sections, and our courses, and our coach education. But she has an acronym called LAST. So it's kind of a helpful thing to remember. The first bit is listen, right? Have them talk out their frustrations, acknowledge it. So the A would be acknowledge, right? Validate how they're feeling. So, they feel terrible and awful. It's not your job as a coach to be like, great job. No, you should be really proud of yourself. You might think you're doing them a favor by saying all those positive things and trying to cheer them up. But really what you're doing is you're not validating that they feel terrible. So validate it, right? That's your job. Validate that they're feeling. I totally understand. I understand that you're feeling horrible. It's not a good feeling when you bum out, instead of just trying to cheer them up. But you're not going to let them wallow. You're not going to sit there and support their wallowing. So then we have to sort of shift their focus. So the S and last would be shift. Shift their focus from what just happened to what happens next. Right. So help them focus on what they can control. They can't control what just happens, but what are we going to do next time? What's our next opportunity? Right. What can we do next to make sure that we're successful next time? And that gets them to start thinking about sort of future actions and ways to sort of shift focus off of, the unfortunate events. And then the T and last would be take action. So what are we going to do? Right. Then we can sort of have that action plan. Like, we don't want to have this feeling again. It doesn't feel good. We don't want to bum out again. Let's talk about the steps we're going to take to do that. Right. So I think that was a really helpful acronym that Betsy, shared with us. And then also the idea that there should be a debrief. Like, you can't just let it go. Right. If something bad happens at a competition, you can't just let it go. Because the athlete's going to be like, well, my coach doesn't care for me anymore. I know I'm upset, but I can't believe coach isn't coming over to talk to me. I'm a failure. My coach doesn't believe in me. I let them down. You do have to have that conversation with them. And it's a hard conversation to have. So, that might be something you have to practice. It might be something that, you do with an assistant coach if you're not comfortable, but at some point that has to happen. So those are sort of things I think about with competition.
Well, one more scenario. Could we go through the scenario that you described, missed warm-up rep or reps, and how you would behave differently depending on what type of athlete is in front of you?
Yeah, I think you have to think too about the level of competition. My favorite competitions are the youth kids, right? They're my absolute favorite. We're not going to be opening at a weight where I'm worried that they're missing it. So if they miss something in the back room, like, I know, we're giving them every opportunity to be successful with the load that we're putting on the bar. It's a little bit different. And again, I'm not in these situations. I'm not coaching, at an international level, but, imagining that you have a higher level athlete and they're going for a big opener that's not so easy to make, and they've just missed one in the back. That's where kind of knowing your athlete really comes into play. And I've seen coaches react, no problem, you got this, shake it off. I've seen athletes, freak out and have a bad opener. There isn't, I don't think, one right way to handle it, but I would certainly want to have spent a lot of time in training, making sure that athlete believes in themselves and believes that they can do the lift, because I think weightlifting is a sport where a lot of it is between your ears. There are some studies looking at, blinded loading and what athletes can do versus like, oh my gosh, those are double reds. Oh my gosh. Right. So there is something to be said for psyching yourself out and needing to make sure that your athlete feels confident doing that. So, I would want to make sure that they've taken, similar approaches up to heavy attempts in training, and that they know that they can draw on a lot of memories of having done that before and made the next lift, right? So that's not something you're going to fix on the day of. That's not something you're going to like rah into a lifter, but you need to make sure that in your preparation for that, they can draw upon 50 instances in training where they missed a heavy attempt and came back and made it on the next attempt. And that the only sort of item in their brain of, I just missed this, is that moment or the last meet where the same thing happened, right? You need them to draw upon, I've done this 50 times. I know I can do this, and to walk away from it. And so the bigger deal you make out of it, for that athlete, you may be signaling that you're not so confident. Go lower their opener. If they feel terrible and they tell you like, I've got a stomach bug, like, yeah, lower their opener. But you still need to, I think, cultivate that ability to come back from a missed attempt in the warm-up room in training.
Thank you. The role of reflection in developing coaching practice, maybe what it is first, and then why it is important or useful for the coaches, and then we will go into how it is.
So I think you can think of reflection as happening at two moments in time, right? The first would be during a sporting event, during a competition, and then one would be after, right? So reflecting in the moment or reflecting on the moment, sort of two different things. And then I think coaches would go through, 3 levels of reflection. So when you say like, hey, reflect, a lot of times people think, yeah, am I effective? Am I efficient as a coach? And it's really sort of technical. So the first level of reflection is more technical in nature. So you might be thinking about like, how can I better structure the warm up? Or how do I get everyone to finish, by 5 o'clock? I want to go home. Or, should I have used a hang above knee clean, or should I have done it from the low blocks? Like what would make more sense in that session? I'm sort of second guessing exercise selection. The next level of reflection would be more practical. So we're analyzing sort of the athletes in front of us, considering sort of the fuller context of the training environment, the sport culture, the group dynamics that might be present in that session. And that might be also where you start to reflect on your communication. So, you might be thinking about what is it about the way that I structured the warm up that doesn't work with these athletes, as opposed to like, how can I do it better? It's more, what was it about the way I did it that didn't work well with this particular group of athletes, right? How are my own experiences about how I was coached influencing what I expect of my athletes and what I expect of others? So it's a little bit more introspective in that way. And you might also start to be thinking about more broadly, how are your values and morals and your ethics, and how is your experience shaping what you do? So you might start thinking about like, how does the feedback that I give a lifter communicate or reinforce, gender stereotypes or racial stereotypes? And you might be sort of thinking along those lines. And I would say the third level of reflection is critical reflection. So that's more, moral, ethical, political level of, how are you using your knowledge? So you might be looking at why you gave more feedback to your top group of lifters, or why did you give more critical feedback to, this particular athlete? Or you might be wrestling with something related to a lifter that's not really recovered from a surgery and still wants to compete in a couple of months. Like, is that ethically the right thing for you to be doing, right? Those difficult situations. And like I said, coaches will probably start at the technical level and sort of gradually progress to reflect, at the practical and critical levels. And then, it sort of depends on their experience. It's hard to sort of draw from limited experience, but we learn about the value of reflection from teaching, right? Teachers are coaches. So we sort of start to think about, what can we do to get teachers to be most effective? And there's a lot of literature on, types of reflection and the value of reflection for teachers. And I think it's really important for coaches to draw on that literature as well. And kind of like what I talked about with what we're trying to help our athletes and kind of learn a little bit more about self-awareness and mindfulness as we start to think about how to shape behavior change. We can sort of look at increasing coaches' awareness of their own behavior, maybe coaches reflecting on their own values or their own, particular code of ethics, if they sort of think about their coaching philosophy, and maybe that awareness helps them think a little bit more about how that shapes them. That self-awareness, I think, helps them be more inclusive and helps foster like a greater sense of belonging in their, coaching environment. And then I think they're more sensitive to sort of circumstances of their athletes. So you start to consider a little bit more what do athletes need? And then they think more about that when they deliver, whatever it is they're delivering in terms of communication. Whereas previously it might have just been about what they need. Like, I need the athletes out of 5. I need 2 athletes, in this competition. But I think it raises awareness of how their values and their perspective sort of shapes how they deal with other people. To your other question about types of reflection, I think there's different types of reflection that can be really valuable, and there's no like one type that's great for any single person. But I would say the 2 probably most common would be journaling, like written reflection. So you're going to maybe keep like a coaching notebook or a coaching journal, and you're not just going to write like, dear diary, this is what happened today. Right? You have to dig a little bit deeper than that. You have to sort of think about, okay, maybe we can go through a couple steps. Like, what happened? What did I do? Not was it good or bad, but like, what happened? What did I do? Like, a session went totally not according to plan, right? There was a huge argument, between lifters. Like, what happened? What did I do? Then we can start to think about, what does that mean? Right? What does that mean for my coaching? How does that reflect my principles or not? And then how did you come to be that way? How did that happen? So the sort of social and cultural aspects of how that came to be. And then, of course, the important bit of how would you do that differently, right? So alternative, options for how could I handle that differently, and what is your goal for handling that in the future? So that's just kind of looking at, one way you might approach reflective journaling. Another thing you could do is have a conversation with an assistant coach. Maybe the staff gets together. Maybe it's another colleague that isn't necessarily, at your gym, but you might start having this conversation. It's the same thing you might ask athletes, right? What went well? What didn't go well? What would you do differently? How can you apply this? You might say like, hey, what are you going to do now? How are you going to integrate this new information, into what you do? I mean, how are you going to integrate this new skill that you learned or what this insight you gained about this athlete? Like how is that going to change your coaching practice? And then how will you know that actually worked? I think that's a really important question. So you're going to do this thing. It's going to be different than what you normally do, but how do you know that it was successful? Right? So what are your sort of things that you're looking for to see, did it work or not? Because ultimately you're going to have to iterate. And then, how might you have done it differently? So similar questions, talking through with another person is helpful for people sometimes, but bouncing ideas off, or other people, prefer to just reflect in a notebook. And a lot of our USA Weightlifting courses, we sort of ask coaches to reflect. Like we feel strongly that reflection is a habit that good coaches engage in. And so we just sort of get them started and thinking about different ways to reflect. So what did you learn today, for example, that was new, that was different? In what ways did it confirm or not confirm what you had believed, right? So if we were talking, Alex, it would be like, hey, maybe you believed internal cueing and external cueing were a little bit different than the way I described, right? So you can sort of discuss that a little bit. Like, how was that different? What are you still thinking about? Like, what was still challenging? Like, well, I'm still kind of thinking about how to handle this athlete. It was really tricky for me, or what I would do in this situation. And then what are some ways that you can immediately implement what you learned, right? So taking that, I learned this thing, but how am I tomorrow going to start to implement this? So just different ways that we get coaches starting to think about what I learned, how it was new or different, what was different, how are you going to deal with it, how you're going to manage the new information. And a lot of times that's like, wow, I did not see that. There was an athlete doing this thing and all the coaches said they were doing this thing and I did not see it. I really need to watch more lifts, to be more confident that what I'm seeing is what I should be saying to the athlete. Like the 3-rep rule needs to happen. I just need more reps. Could be something as simple as that they learned and made a deliberate point to do. But I think, going back to this idea of all great coaches, right? Great communicators, they're also really good at reflecting in a way that's meaningful and will change their practice going forward. So I think that idea that coaches need to reflect in some format isn't something that we talk about a whole lot, but can make a really big difference as coaches develop over time.
Okay, I didn't ask you for communication. Is it anything you want to add to communication or to reflections topic, but I didn't ask about?
You're using one of my questions back at me. Is there anything you'd like to share that I haven't already asked you? I love it. I'll say one thing that always really stuck with me. I mentioned Betsy Butterick, who is a communication specialist, right, and a former basketball coach. And I think she's really brilliant. She's got a lot of free videos, great website. But she said something in a talk that really connected with me that I think was really helpful, which is that all great teams have chemistry, right? You want to kind of create chemistry. I know weightlifting, individual sport, right? But this idea that people are supporting each other. You can have a training environment that is really, really wonderful for everyone in it, and you cannot, right? So I think everyone, even in weightlifting, can relate to that. And this idea that chemistry is actually built through connection, and how we build connection is primarily done through communication. So if you sort of agree with the general idea that in the top level of sport, right, everyone kind of knows similar things about, X's and O's, then it's getting to those applied things, getting those individuals to really connect. And being really deliberate and effective in your communication sort of leads us to believe that we really need to place more value on teaching coaches and training coaches how to be effective communicators, because I don't think they realize how much those skills really matter until they're on the job. And I'm not saying that we're going to get coaches that never make mistakes, or that there isn't value in learning from the mistakes that we all make and continue to make, right? But when we talk about being a great coach, a lot of it is like the secret to bar path, or the secret to lift off, or the secret biomechanical hack you never knew. And it just really comes down to how much deliberate effort I think people put into communication. It's just sort of undervalued, I guess.
Okay, anything exciting coming up soon?
We've got something exciting coming up. We just released USA Weightlifting Coaching Foundation. So as I'm sitting here telling you how important it is to reflect and be effective in communication, we've got a variety of short, free courses for all USA Weightlifting members that are almost all sport agnostic, right? This idea that there are things that all good coaches need to know and do that don't really tie into the sport itself. Right. And that's to help coaches navigate areas like coaching ethics, right? Or crafting their own coaching philosophy. Or one that I'm really excited about is communication, most effectively with Generation Z, improving the culture, of your program, getting better at doing things like acknowledging and validating, people, especially in difficult situations as a coach. So we have several of those modules, and those were developed in partnership, some of them with the Susan Crown Exchange. We're a grant recipient for the Million Coaches Challenge, which is trying to help educate youth sport coaches in sort of athlete-centered, whole athlete coaching, focused on social, emotional development of youth, right? We're not training athletes, we're training humans. And so we're really pleased to offer, some of those courses and some fellowship and scholarship programs, as part of that Million Coach Challenge to help coaches, particularly working with youth in underserved communities. So we're trying to help them with sport skills, and you can visit the USA Weightlifting website for more information about that. But that's something that I think we're really excited about. So we can put our money where our mouth is and saying that we believe these are foundational things for all coaches to know. We're going to put that out there and help coaches, through that as they work through that on their own journey.
That sounds exciting. Your favorite color?
My favorite color is purple.
Noted. So Evidence Strong started with making infographics. It becomes less and less in terms of time I spend doing infographics versus doing other things like this interview. But I will keep it in mind. If I make an infographic for this interview, that will be the color of it. And the last question, where people can find you to learn more and contact with you.
People can find me on a small farm in the middle of nowhere in the Appalachian Mountains of East Tennessee. So good luck. No, just kidding. I would say the best way to get a hold of me is email. Anna.Swisher@usaweightlifting.org would be the best way to get a hold of me. I do have a social media account, but it's largely my children and my adventuring through the mountains. Probably not really what people are after, unless you love adventuresome, mountainous content. So anyway, I would say the best way to do that is to either shoot me an email or, take a look at the USAW website, but email would be great. And I'd be happy to chat with folks that have other questions.
Thank you so much for today, and see you next time.
Yeah. Thank you for having me. Really appreciate it.